Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Seminar in syntax and semantics, and we will start off with Graham Steele, condensing a million message attack into 25 minutes.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that.
Thanks very much. So it's great to be here. So I'm here for the Syntax and Semantics series seminar, Is Cryptography Theory Practically Useful?, which is going to be next week. So I am not a mathematician or really a cryptographer. I'm actually a researcher in informal methods. But I've chosen today to talk about something which I hope will be at least a little bit amusing for a general audience. So I'm aware that the mathematics in it is entirely elementary, and what's more, I'm going to skip over a lot of the stuff to try and get it finished in 25 minutes. But it should at least give you guys an idea of what kind of problems we're interested in, and maybe it'll be fun. So 14 years ago, there was a paper that came out which was a very big deal in cryptography research, because at the time people were debating notions of what it means for a cryptographic system to be secure, and what it meant to attack such a system, what was a realistic scenario, what it really meant for all these things, how to make them precise. And there was a notion going around being talked about which was called a chosen ciphertext attack. Okay? And there was some debate about whether this thing, whatever it is, was really a realistic threat, and whether it's something that people should really be concerned about. Then this paper came out by this very smart guy called Daniel Bleichenbacher, demonstrating just such an attack on what was at the time a cryptographic system that was in ubiquitous use. And what's more, he showed that this attack was really, relatively speaking, very practical. So what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to give you a very quick flavor of what that attack was like, to give you an idea of how these things are, and give you a very small result that we recently proved, which allows us to make this attack, which used to take a million messages, and I'll show you what it means for an attack to take a million messages, that enables you to do this thing in 15,000 messages. Okay, so why is that significant? Well, this cryptographic system is used a lot less than it was at the time this paper came out 14 years ago, right? But it is still used. It's used in lots of scenarios where people think, well, okay, so we have this system, we know there's this attack that takes a million messages, but actually that's going to take so long, it's going to be beyond the useful lifetime of the key, the device will time out, everything is fine, so we don't worry about it. But in fact, what our result has shown is that you really do have to be worried about this, and in fact, these people should stop using this system straight away. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So I'm assuming pretty much everybody in the room will have seen how RSA encryption and decryption works before, but let's just have a very, very short recap. So the idea is that I want to have an asymmetric encryption system. So that is, I can give my encryption key to anybody, and I keep a secret decryption key. Anybody can send me a message, and only I can decrypt it, and somebody in the middle won't be able to read what that message says. Okay? So how that works, I'm going to set some typically very large number n that we're going to call the modulus. I have two exponents, a public exponent e and a private exponent d. And how do I get these things? Well, so n is typically the product of two very large primes, and I have the property that d is congruent to 1 modulo phi of n, so the totient function of n. Okay, so how this works in practice, if I have some message m that I want to send to somebody secretly, I take my message m, I raise it to the power of e, I take that modulo the public modulus n, and that gives me some ciphertext c, okay? And that's the ciphertext I'm going to send to the recipient, and the recipient, when he gets c, he raises this to his secret exponent d. Again, he takes mod n, and that gives him back the message m. Okay? And that's all we need to know about this for today. There are all sorts of complex properties of various ways you might want to attack this using clever number theory, but we're not going to be interested in those today. We're just going to be interested in how you actually use this thing in practice and how that gives way to attacks. Okay? So typically, what I want to send to my friend is not a big integer. Okay? I don't have some big integer I really want to communicate to someone. I have some message. So I'm going to have to encode that message into an integer such that I can put it into my system here. Okay? So it's important that my value m is definitely less than the modulus n, okay, right? Otherwise this is obviously not going to work. So the way that I typically go about this is I take my message, so let's say I have a plain text message P. So often this will actually be another cryptographic key that I want to send to somebody. So the reason for that is that asymmetric encryption, doing these exponentiation operations, is quite slow. So typically what I want to do is send somebody a symmetric key for a symmetric key crypto system, which is fast, and then we're going to use that to talk to each other. Okay? So this thing P is just some string of random bytes. So I'm going to write these out as bytes. So the way we normally write these, we're going to write these in hexadecimal. So I've got a whole bunch of bytes here. Okay, and I've got some length L, some number of bytes. And so how am I going to put this, unambiguously encode this into being some message M? Well, the way that it was being done 14 years ago was following a standard called PKCS1 version 1.5. Don't worry about the actual numbers, but what it looks like is this. I take a block, and the first byte I set to 0, okay? So this is it. I'm not going to keep putting the hexadecimal code. So all my digits here are going to be hexadecimal. So that's 4 bits and 4 bits. So the reason I start with a 0 is just to make sure that the value that I get is always going to be less than the modulus, right? Then in the next block I put a 0 and a 2. So if I'm making a signature, this is going to be a 1, but in the case that I'm doing encryption, this is going to be a 2. Doesn't really matter why. Then I'm going to make some random padding, okay? So how long is this random padding going to be? Well, so the whole block, if I say that I have k bytes in this block, so k is the byte length of the modulus n, so typically we use moduluses of something like 1024 bits, then I'm going to put in some random padding here, and the only thing I require of the bytes inside here is that they are non-zero, okay? So I'm going to have some number of bytes which are random. I'm going to have a 0 byte that marks the end of the random padding and the beginning of the actual message, and then I'm going to stick in the plain text P, okay? And that's going to be my whole block, right? So then I just interpret this as an integer M, and that's the message I'm going to use to do this encryption with. Okay, so what's interesting about this? Well, so what Bleikenbacher observed was, suppose the following situation. Suppose I don't have a way of decrypting the messages that I'm getting, but somewhere in your system there's a function that allows me to find out whether some ciphertext C, when it's decrypted using the private modulus D, gives some value which could be a valid plain text, okay? So it doesn't have to tell me whether what the actual plain text value is or anything else about it. It just has to tell me whether or not it's some correctly padded PKCS1 block, okay? So why is that a realistic scenario? Well, actually, it's completely realistic. It happens all the time. Every time, for example, you pay with your credit card on the internet, you start a session with a server somewhere using this RSA cryptography, and what you do is you send to the server the session key that you want to use, more or less, in one of these encryption blocks. And if you send a block which doesn't come out to be a valid block like this, then the session will terminate, okay? The server will refuse to talk to you. So you've learned something then. You've learned that the thing that you decrypted didn't turn out to be one of these valid blocks, okay? So let's suppose the existence of some oracle which takes a ciphertext C and tells me whether this corresponds to some plain text which is a valid padding, okay? So what does that mean? Well, Bleikenbacher observed that supposing I have some ciphertext that I've derived by taking a real message M and raising it to the power and multiplying it by S raised to the power of the encryption exponent E, okay? So I've got some, hang on, let me get this right around. I'm going to get a ciphertext. I'm going to multiply it by some number S raised to the public exponent E, okay? So I'm going instead of sending the original ciphertext into this decryption function, I'm sending my modified ciphertext. So the whole thing gets raised to the private exponent D, and the result is that my oracle is going to look at the value of M times S, and it's going to tell me whether M times S is really a possible valid plain text block, okay? So this gives me a way of trying different values S, multiplying them against some ciphertext that I have, and finding out whether M times S is a valid block. And that's exactly how we're going to make the attack. So what does it mean if I find out that something is a valid block? Well, it means that if I interpret this as an integer, And if I set this value, I'm going to set this value, so if I put a 1 at the beginning here and interpreted that as an integer, I'm going to call that value b, capital B, just because that's the constant that Bleikenbacher uses in his paper. So now I know that 2 times b is less than or equal to m times s, which is strictly less than 3b. Okay? And why have I learned that? Well, I've learned that just because I had some ciphertext, I multiplied it by this s, and I found out that whatever m times s is, I don't know what it is, but it gives a block which decrypts to give a valid block in here. Okay? And so that gives me this inequality. And this was what Bleikenbacher realized, and he realized that if he could just keep trying different s's, and every time he got a solution like this, he could give himself a better and better interval for the real value of m. Okay? So he starts off with a value of m that is in fact somewhere between 2b and 3b, right? Because the first m is also a valid block. So what I do is I have some original ciphertext, C, okay, and I don't know the value of m, all right? And what I'd like to know is what is that value of m. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my ciphertext, I'm going to multiply it by s raised to the public exponent e. So everyone knows e, anybody can do that operation. Now I'm going to send that to this oracle that will tell me whether something is a valid, decrypts to give a valid padded block or not. Yes, exactly. Something I choose. So I'll explain a little bit more about how you get the s's, because that's exactly where the magic is, right? So I've got some s, and I found out that it decrypts, and then I can apply this relation, right?
You're checking whether c times s to the e decrypts to something.
Decrypts to something which is a valid block. So if the oracle says it's not a valid block, I don't know, I just carry on. But eventually I find one that is a valid block, then I can apply this inequality, and I can restrict my hypothesis about what the range of m really is, okay? So at the beginning I just know that m is somewhere between 2b and 3b, because it's also a valid block. Then I find out that m times s for some s is in this range. So the reason this doesn't make any sense is because I forgot to put the mod n in, right? That's probably why this was looking strange. So that's what the encryption oracle is really doing. It's taking c to the d mod n. So what does that mean when I've multiplied something that's in between 2b and 3b by s, and I've found out that once you do mod n, you get back within this range. So I know that there's some constant, so Bleikenbacher calls it a value r, which is a bit strange because it's not the remainder. So some value r times n plus some, so what should we call the remainder, t, this is equal to m times s, and this t is within this range 2b to 3b, right? So once I find one of these s's, I can work out upper and lower bounds for this value r. So this is exactly what the Bleikenbacher algorithm does. And for each of those, the values in between the upper and the lower bound, I can find a new range for the possible values of m, okay? So what typically happens is I start with s equals 0, and I just increase s. Okay, I don't really start at 0, but I start at some low bound. I just increase s naively one after the other until I find a block that hits, okay? And when the block hits, I get lots of different values for r. Each of those different values for r gives me a separate, usually disjoint interval for possible values of m. So I take those intervals and then I repeat. And I just keep going, keep increasing my s, and slowly decreasing these intervals until I only have one left. When I only have one left, I can do some clever stuff that helps me find the s more quickly that I can show you later if you want, but it's in the Bleikenbacher paper as well. And eventually I get down to only one possible value, okay? So, why is this the million message attack? Precisely because Bleikenbacher analyzed the runtime of this little algorithm and estimated that it would take 2 to the 20 operations, so 2 to the 20 different values tried for s, till we had enough correct values that we would only get down to one possible value for the message m, okay? So this is why it's called the million message attack. So how did we improve this recently? Well, so what we realized was you can do the same trick here, but you can also multiply by some other number. So let's multiply by t raised to a negative exponent, okay? So the effect of this is that you find out whether or not the value m times s divided by t is within this range, okay? So why is that? So you're thinking, well, this is a bit bizarre. You're dividing within this modulus. Suppose you don't get an integer. Suppose this isn't an exact divisor of m over s. You'll get some crazy value in here, so you won't be able to learn anything. But what we were able to show was that for certain restrictions on the values of s and t, it will be the case that t will divide, you'll get a conforming plaintext only in the case where t exactly divides m times s, and that allows you to deduce better upper and lower bounds for the initial value of m. Okay? So why is that in itself useful? Well, I said that the naive algorithm, when you're looking for the values of s, is just to start with s equals 1 and keep increasing until you find something. But of course, we can very quickly improve on that. There's no real point trying s that's so low that s times m is not bigger than at least 1 times n plus 2b, okay? Because we want to multiply m in such a way that at least the value increases enough that the modulus chops off a part of it and leaves us with a little bit more for the remainder, okay? But if we've managed also to decrease the bounds of 3b and 2b on the initial m, we can essentially improve that calculation, and this gives us a whole bunch of possible values. So for each of the possible initial values of r, so for 1, for 2, for 3, for 4, we can give ourselves bounds on what the possible values of s must be, and what we get is essentially holes in the space where s cannot possibly be a valid value. And that enables us to skip a whole bunch of them. So that on itself does not account for the fact that we managed to reduce the attack down to only 15,000 messages. Some of that is essentially due to cheating. So what do I mean by cheating? Well, so Bleikenbacher's estimate of 1 million messages was based on the fact that what we might start with, this value c, may not actually be the encryption of a valid plaintext, okay? So we may have to do what's called a blinding step, where we start looking for values of s just to get the first possible hit such that c times s raised to the e actually decrypts to give a valid plaintext block. And that takes about 300,000 messages on its own, okay? So already we're down to 700,000 messages on average. But we were able to show that with our hole skipping technique, so this technique where we trim the initial values of m, combined with an existing optimization, which will take quite a long time to describe, which was due to some other guys, Klima and some other people back in 2003, then we really are able to reduce this down. And by playing with the possible parameters, so how many different values of s and t we should try in this trick we do at the beginning, so it turns out that the best thing to do is to try about 1,500 possible values. That's how we were able to get down to 15,000 median for the attack. Okay, so go ahead.
Concrete numbers that you're mentioning
Yeah.
is for some key lengths?
Yeah, right. So it's a funny thing that actually doesn't depend that much on the key length, because as you increase the key length, you actually find that the chance that if you have a random string in here, okay, so anything that starts with 0002, not everything that starts 0002 will give a valid plaintext, right? Notice that you have to have at least 1 0 somewhere, otherwise it can't possibly be correct. And there's a minimum length for the random padding, okay? So the minimum length for the random padding is 8 bytes. So it turns out that actually as the keys get longer, a greater proportion of plaintexts that start with 0002 are valid plaintext. So as you increase the key length, you do have slightly harder work because your m is coming from a bigger space of values. But then it's easier to find the s values because more of the values that you find that start 0002 will be passed by the oracle. So the effects almost balance each other out. It is slightly longer to do, for example, 2048 bits. But yeah, the figures I'm giving, the concrete figures are all from 1024. Okay. Yeah, okay, so we're a practical research group, so what we're interested in is how to apply this technique to real systems which are being used. So in recent experiments, we got hold of a whole bunch of cryptographic hardware, so things like smart cards. So you all have these cards with chips on for paying for things in shops now, right? They have a little chip on them and there's a little computer in there. So these chips support a cryptographic interface. On your credit card it's very tightly locked down, but they're also sold as general purpose devices, which has a command which allows you to receive a symmetric key from an outside system and import it into the device using RSA decryption, okay? So how does that work? Some big ciphertext block C arrives. You ask the command, please unwrap this block and turn it into a symmetric key. And the box does one of two things. It either succeeds in its decryption, takes the plain text and stores that a key and tells you nothing, or it says, no, I can't import that as a key because that's not a valid plain text block, okay? So this is a practical instance of exactly that oracle, right? Exactly the oracle that Bleikenbacher assumed to exist. So these pieces of cryptographic hardware, because they take a very long time to develop, and in order to make money from them, the manufacturers keep selling them for a long time. All the ones that we tested still support this old way of doing encryption. Okay, so 14 years after the million message attack of Bleikenbacher came out, they're still doing their encryption this way. And for example, the electronic ID card of, so I shouldn't really say which state, but certain European states still use this method of decryption on their electronic ID cards. Okay. So what we were able to show is that if you only need 15,000 messages to make the attack, even though these electronic little chip cards are actually quite slow at doing their RSA decryption, using 15,000 messages you can in a couple of hours crack a plain text. Okay. So why is it interesting to crack a plain text? Well, particularly because in the case of the use of these cards, normally this thing P is a symmetric key. Okay, it's the key that's going to be used for some more communication afterwards. And in the case of ID cards, what's usually happening is actually you're using this function to forge a signature. And forging a signature with an ID card obviously is pretty serious, because in some countries the electronic signatures have legal value. Okay. Another place where we found that these attacks exist is in what are called hardware security modules. So every time you go to a bank machine and you type in your PIN to take out some money from your account, somewhere in a warehouse belonging to your bank is a large box about this size, usually in a huge rack of them with lots of fans and cooling and things going on. And inside those boxes are cryptographic processors designed to do cryptographic operations extremely fast. And again, these things are very expensive. They cost about 20,000 euros per box. It depends how many you buy and who you buy them from. And again, that means that the systems they use tend to stay in place and not get updated very much. And the result is that they all still support this way of doing encryption. Okay. And in fact, that's very dangerous, because these large boxes do this kind of decryption very, very fast. So you're able to mount this 15,000 message attack in just a few seconds. Some of the better devices defend against this quite cleverly. So what they do is the commands of this box are expecting to receive a symmetric key in this plain text here, okay? And they know that this key is supposed to be of some particular length. So instead of giving you a message that says that I couldn't accept this block because it didn't give a valid padding when it decrypted, I give the same error message in every case, except in the case where I have not just a valid block, but a valid block that has a 0 in exactly the right place, such that the plain text is the right length to make a key. Okay? And just this small change to the implementation of the encryption makes the attack significantly harder. It takes something like 13 million steps on average, even with our optimization, to go ahead and make the attack. And 13 million is quite significant, even with these very, very fast boxes. So it would take something like 48 hours to make the attack, and by which time you would hope that some other part of the security in the system would have noticed that you were doing these suspicious sequences of commands and would reject you from the device. Okay. So you don't need to be too worried about your bank PIN, but you should perhaps be worried about your ID card, depends which country you're from. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and if you've got any questions, or if you want to talk to me later, so I'm around until next week, I'd love to explain some of this in more detail.
Are there any questions right now? One thing that in a different situation, when a company has a mailing list which it doesn't want to get stolen, what it will sometimes do is put a few fake addresses in there, you know, the CEO's home address or something like this, and then if anything gets sent to those, you know, the fake name at this address, it knows somebody has stolen this.
Uh-huh.
If you're just looking for a plain text which works, would it be plausible, you know, in a country of 10 million individuals to have 100 million ID cards, only 10% of which actually belong to people, and then if somebody comes up with one of the other 90 million, you say, hey, you know, you're under arrest.
Okay, so what you're saying, let me try and get this right. So you're saying that your defense of this would be that you would accept a whole bunch of blocks here, but there would be certain kind of trigger ones, and if you spotted someone using one of those, you would guess that they were trying to mount one of these attacks. Right? Yeah, that might be interesting.
Rough sense, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm no expert here, and it's something I thought of in 2 minutes, so this can't be too sophisticated. But
Sure, yeah.
just as an idea.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Don't these computers notice that there's zillions of questions coming from a source?
So something like these hardware boxes, they're just designed to operate extremely fast. So they don't have any memory inside them about what the last operation was. They just receive a request, process it really fast, and give you the output. Okay? So they're totally dumb in that sense. The banks do have a sort of defense in-depth system. So outside of that, they have systems called velocity checkers, which monitor the sequence of commands that are arriving to some device and try and look for suspicious patterns. But that's a whole other problem, how to design your attack so that it escapes whatever pattern checker they're using and all this kind of thing. That's a whole other field.
You said you were here through the conference?
For 1 week, yeah, until Thursday next week.
Okay. Well, you come through here, and thanks again.
Thanks.